Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second session today, where we have 6 more artists. We have 5 that are here in person and 1 who is here via Zoom, RaVae, so she's going to go first. Let's make sure that she's here.
I'm here.
Okay, I will change slides at your direction.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you about my work today. My exhibition, Visceral, is the recent body of work on which I've been concentrating, and it was last shown in this exhibition in Rapid City, South Dakota. I tend to work in series, kind of like a chemist or a scientist who does an experiment and develop a narrative or a thesis on which to work. My work is confrontive. It always contains mystery. And it isn't always easy to look at or to understand. It doesn't matter if there's a subject that's recognizable or if it's an abstract piece. It still is mysterious and requires concentration. Take time to study it and wonder, what's happening here? What am I supposed to take from this? That's the mystery. Unlike the other artists here today, my work does not reflect my surroundings, the land or the water. My work is internal. I put concepts out as directly and raw as I can. And if it comes across direct and raw, you may feel it is horrific. This painting, entitled Torn Sheets, is concerned with relationships. It is also true that when I am painting anything, I'm at the same time painting myself. The work is almost nearer to a self-portrait that I'm working on. I'm working through all sorts of very private feelings about behavior, emotion, and about life in general. This work is internal. Serious painting is personal. Using deer as a metaphor, I'm dealing with the human condition. And of course, the human condition is made up of the experiences, characteristics, and limitations of life that we all share. That's the human condition. That would be things like love, celebration, respect, fear, suffering, death, and survival. Of those, respect may be the most important human condition. Dark Red Velvet Trilogy is the title of this painting. It's an acrylic, and it was the very first one that I painted in South Dakota in front of the hanging deer, hanging just like that. It is fleshy. I was enamored by the color of the meat. I loved the color and the motion of the hanging figures. It's kind of a meat market. Or is it a beauty pageant, which is sometimes a meat market? Okay, Ghostly November Memory. This is regarding memories of others who have passed. They're present, but they're in our distant memory, not as sharply focused as at one time, but leaving trails for us to follow and to remember. Night Dance. This painting was done the other way around as hanging deer, but I choose to show it upside down because I think it's funny. The deer are actively dancing. Their little heads on their very skinny necks are moving from left to right, dancing, and actually the movement is coming from the white in the background rather than on the heads of the deer themselves. They're wearing these funny Turkish pants. And it's kind of funny because when they're hanging upside down, those are actually the white bags that we carry the deer in when we bring them home from the field to keep the meat clean. So they read as pants, but it's really the bags. Okay, then comes white robes stained with scarlet. There are 6 deer here, and I very quickly learned the anatomy of the deer so that I could take a deer and hang it in any direction, twist its body, put the drape on it, take the drape off, and know exactly where the blood is going to come through onto the white bag. My sons called this one, they made a studio title for it, called 4 in Negligees and 2 Buck Naked. That's been rather difficult to get away from. Okay, Peter, how about whitetails in sunset? I find the best part of this painting is the very center, the yellow part where the hooks are. And I've discovered in this painting, since that's where the mystery is, I don't need the deer anymore. I also learned that while the mark is the most important expressive part of my paintings, it doesn't have to be a brushstroke. It can be a drip. It can be thrown, it can be dripped down the canvas, just as it is off of these white bags in this canvas. So the marks are as expressive, the drips are as expressive as any mark is. Okay, and then as a result of that, knowing that I don't need the deer anymore, this is gone, October's breath. You see, I don't need the canvas, the carcass anymore. I still have the mystery. We still wonder what happened there. What are we supposed to take from it? But why do we need so many hooks? And are the hooks the mystery? Or is it the atmosphere around the hooks? So that developed into hook, one painting, one hook. When hung at the right height, this is fairly intimidating because if it's hung low enough, you feel the hook right into your chest. It's enough for mystery, and the activated brushstrokes in the background are enough for the expression. So there's an example of getting rid of the deer. Now, the next thing is, the next experiment was to say, okay, if we just use the ribs, then what? So where do we hold grief? In the center of our chest, don't we? Our ribs protect our internal organs, our hearts. It is the safe, protective structure. But what if we turn the rib cage? The next one is called descending. We feel dread, fear. Do you feel it? You don't know how far you can go into that hole. Is it going to end? Does it go on forever? Colors intense, the marking system and the drips are present. So the emotion is there and personally interpreted by the viewer. This led me to the next one, which is called Atonement, Bearing Witness. This is an acrylic and mixed media piece, which is quite large. It's about 6 feet tall. And it is depicts the human condition in Christianity. which is a humanity that is in communion with God, with each other, and the world around us. Now, antlers don't grow down, do they? Typically, they grow up. These antlers are forced down because it's oppressive. It is a sad, dramatic gesture as the eye is forced down around the edge of the painting past a obviously dead body, where it hits the bottom of the image and is forced back up by more antlers to direct the eye back up to the top and then back down again. And if you look at each of the canvases, if with that in mind, you'll see that I'm directing your eye in each of them to try to cover the whole canvas. Then this next one is the last painting that I did in that series. And this is my friend Bruce Hall, who came to South Dakota to see the show with his wife, Diane. This shows you the scale. It's about 10 feet high. The ribs were at one point open, and then I folded them up. They closed and closed, and the whole thing became very tactile. It's something that you would like to go up and touch. Okay, Peter, I think that sums it up for me.
All right. Thank you very, very much for that.
Well, thanks a lot for having me, everybody. As expressed by lots of people, it's just such a joy to be here with all the other artists. Big thanks to Peter, Richard, and Pat, Yael, all the people involved with both institutions, because, last May, all the artists from San Juan came to Salt Spring Island, and it was just, since then, it's been a great experience meeting other artists, talking to people, and who knows, I might come here one day. I've heard great things about the Alchemy Art Center, and especially in terms of photography. So thanks a lot for having me. So I'm showing 2 bodies of work at the museum, and this is really helpful for me to talk about my work in general. I have a pretty project-oriented approach to photography. I came to photography through a love of music, and particularly full albums. I think it's so powerful the way songs can feed off one another and create an experience where the whole is a lot greater than the sum of its parts. And so that heavily informs my approach to image making. While I like taking pictures one at a time, I kind of have that romanticized view of a whole project that people can come and see and experience and see, just like I said with the song, see how the pictures kind of work off one another to have a presence when they're all together. So the first body of work that I'll talk about are the large, colorful ones that are at the museum, and it's a series of mine called Playtime. So Playtime began, I was in a period where I wasn't really using cameras. When I got to art school and got involved with photography, I was shown all these incredible different ways that we can approach and work with photography. So I was using a lot of flatbed scanners, which I guess have a camera in them, but I was also in the darkroom a lot, just working with photo paper. So I would make these things called photograms. And a photogram is any sort of photograph that you make with no camera. Essentially, you could imagine a piece of film with an image on it. And in the darkroom, when you make a print of that picture, it's completely black. Light goes through the negative, and it's kind of transparent. So it projects the image down onto, something like this. You put the paper there, and the paper kind of sees, right, the image that's projected down. Just like film, it's sensitive to light. And there you have your print. But what you can also do is take out the negative. And you can essentially draw or paint with light on the photo paper. It's one of these sides of photography that is really far away from what a lot of people imagine when they hear this word photography. It's not of something out there, but it's something that's been kind of done within the medium the whole time. Man Ray is someone that's often talked about as one of the early practitioners of photograms. I think he might have coined the term even. And that was, that you could go as far back as you like, and there's people working with photography in these ways. So I loved making like sculptures out of these, prints that I would make, really kind of highlighting the physicality of the medium. That's what I love about working with analog materials and technology. Like if the picture's too yellow, you hold it, you have it, you have to, it is a print. And so I would make these sculptures and these installations with these prints. And that was kind of the work. And I showed my class at school, and maybe the other artists could attest to this. The work kind of checked a lot of boxes of what I was thinking about in photography at that time, this physical side of it, using light and paper very directly. But actually looking at the work, I was like, it was kind of missing something. And my professor at the time, he told me to photograph it. And that's where a kind of light bulb went off. I think he just meant so that I could look at the installation in my room or something, or kind of have a documentation of it. But I really liked the idea of the work being this picture that I compose out of these photograms. I was really interested in what's called the multiple exposure process at the time, where you take several or two photographs on the same piece of film. You can do it in digital as well. And what you photograph, they start to interact in the way the light, they kind of blend together. If you ever see images that look like a texture is kind of going through someone's face, this is the multiple exposure effect. And that's how I started photographing my prints. And that's what you're looking at with this series, Playtime. I'm starting in the color darkroom, making all these prints, bringing to a studio. I'm cutting them up and arranging them and crumpling them, as you can kind of see with this one, and taking multiple exposure photographs of them. The only other step is that I then scan the film, and I have a digital image, which is what you're looking at now. The scanning of the film just lets me print the image quite large, which I really like as well. You get this kind of physical effect from looking at a print like that, 40 by 50 inches or so. So while I was working on these, eventually this word playtime kind of came into my head. And prior to this series, I was naming my pictures just by responding with sounds when I was looking at them. Some of my pictures would be named something like doop or something like that. Some of it were words, but other of them were just kind of sounds that I associated with the images. And that's where the word playtime came from. I was looking at one of the first ones I made, and it just kind of matched perfectly. And everyone I spoke to felt this kind of playful quality to the work. And so when I started doing the second volume, it was in 2019 that I made the first volume like these ones. And I loved this process, this idea of really composing an image as opposed to going out there and finding it. It just seemed like such a different approach to photography because, like a painter or a musician, I'm making everything that's you see in the picture. But as I mentioned before, I'm using darkroom and film, so it's a lot different from photography, but it's also so rooted in the medium itself. So I started thinking a lot about play as an action and what it means to me as an artist, and trying to read about it from philosophers and cultural critics and stuff. And to me, play is the free-flowing actions and behavior that somebody does within some set of rules or guides. And because I was playing so much in the darkroom and in the studio with composing these images, to me it became akin to how we speak about musicians, right? It's so common that we say that they play their instruments. And that's just kind of part of our lexicon when we talk about music. And that tied in nicely to this series because as I mentioned before, we can think about photography in its Greek derivation, light writing or light recording. Now, as an avid listener to music, what I end up experiencing and what I love with music is how these different separately recorded instruments, the bass gets recorded separate from the vocals. Nowadays, you might have a sample from an older piece of music. The magic of it is they really interact with one another when you're listening to it. We never really actually just hear the vocals, even if it's the loudest thing. We always hear these melodies interacting with each other. We're listening to, an interaction of recorded sounds. And through thinking about this work, I realized that I'm too doing a very similar thing. Playing my instruments, the camera, the boundaries of the film, I'm also making this dense, layered mixture of recordings. Except instead of sound, I mix recordings of light, photographs, light recordings. So it's kind of like music for your eyes is how I try to think about it. I was so blown away by especially artists like the Beatles, more recently groups like Animal Collective, but there's so many who they have this appreciation for the album. And each album has its own unique sound. A lot of the melodies are still the same or similar, but each one kind of sounds like its own world. And that's how I try to approach projects. The next series are these darker ones called Water and Light. I had seen a work by an artist named Olafur Eliasson. He's from Iceland. And he had this great series where it was a fountain, pushing water up into the air. But the room was completely dark, but light would flash on for a second. So when you go see it, it's kind of like seeing a photograph live. You just see this flash of light and water in the air. I thought, it has this great sculptural form to it. If I photograph it, maybe the water's going to distort whatever's behind it. So I went out and I have a bottle of water. I throw it in the air and I photograph and I get soaking wet. And when I got the film back from the lab, there was no water that I could see. There was just these orb-like things. And I was very happy because even though it, wasn't what I thought, I loved the look of these orbs. I loved that I didn't know what they were, and it kind of has led me down a research path that I'm still on, trying to understand exactly what it is we're looking at. So generally speaking, this is called backscatter. And backscatter is an optical phenomena where light from the camera, because it's a flash, right, that's on the camera, something to do with how close it is to the lens makes the light hit small, tiny particles of dust, in this case water, and then go back into the lens instead of hitting whatever it's intended to. Something about the optics and probably the curvature of the lens creates these kind of orb-like things. And researching this is pretty funny because, first of all, there's like tons of Google results of how to get rid of these. Like people don't want to see these in their images. And I'm like, no, that's all I want. And the second was that you'll see a lot of these in people's photographs thinking that they have discovered ghosts or spirits or aliens kind of coming to speak with them. And I don't know, something about that is kind of funny to me. And especially when, reading about it, you realize that what these actually are so fascinating in and of themselves. These images are kind of from a world that's much smaller than us and something we can't actually see with our human eye, but that photography can reveal to us and uncover for us. So I've been kind of thinking about these in a similar way to a magic trick. Because like I said, while I understand a bit more about, these circles and what they are, a confusing thing for me is that the thing I see, this kind of, I think you can imagine if I throw water up in the air, it's this kind of sculpturally form, that completely disappears on the film. So I think about it in a similar way to how a magician will use misdirection and properties of the human mind to make it not see something. I'm kind of using technical properties of the camera to make it not see something that's right in front of it. And in general, I see my work as a form of what I call psychedelic magic. Psychedelic not just in a style, which obviously playtime and I think water and light, they maybe give off that kind of an atmosphere, but also in a sort of literal sense. Because when we look at the word psychedelic, it means to uncover or reveal something in the mind, the body, the spirit, psyche, and delos, to uncover. And I think that is really specific to photography. I think water and light's a good example where photography as a medium has this ability to uncover things and reveal things to us. If you just look at a portrait, you might notice something about that person's face that you normally don't, because we're not like staring at each other all the time like this. But because photography freezes time, if we can look at it patiently, we might notice something, we might reveal something that was always there, but for whatever reason we didn't see it. Also with water and light in playtime, we can understand that photography shows us things we had no idea we could even see in the first place. That's about it. I didn't want to have too many of these water and light images because it's actually brand new. And I'm still kind of, as I said, working through it, trying to understand exactly what it is. But yeah, that's about it from me. Thank you very much, everyone.
It's amazing to be here, and an honor, and I'm really grateful to share with so many other artists, and I have a lot of appreciation for all the hard work that went into doing this, and learned much more about the job description for curators and museum directors. It's a lot of work. So this is where it begins for me, and this is from the back of Katy Mountain. This is a place that my wife Shannon and I went and go often to the northwest edge of Katy and look, and in the middle is Mount Maxwell. This is from Mount Maxwell looking back down, so I'm connecting the dots, and in the middle, center, in the distance is San Juan Island. So it shows how close we are. And it encourages imagining all the first people that could wander back and forth in their vessels, and how their sense of boundary and territory must have been different than ours, and probably a lot more open and sharing. So, from thinking wooden canoes, here's my stone canoe that's in progress now. That's about 13 feet long, started as a 13,000-pound chunk of stone. I have, the raven and the fox often come to my studio, and I was working on getting the raven to land on that rock and putting crackers on top. And at that moment, I went to get my camera, and the fox came and got it instead. So we have some animal blessing there. This is another image of the canoe. It's a little further along. My first piece was probably when I was 6 or 7 years old, carving a wooden canoe, and it's only recently that I remember that was one of my first pieces. So it's neat to come back almost 60 years later and put that together. That's the same area. The piece on the right I'm calling Sun Ra. That's a piece of granite on a black granite column. This is my shop, and it's sort of an overview of the kind of wild open shop feel. It's pretty high up on Katy Mountain. In the background you can see that soft hill is moss-covered stone that was shaped by the glaciers, and most of Katy is like that. This is my dad. He loved rocks, trees, music, and art, and he shared that with me, so I feel like that's coming through in my art. And we're sitting together on that stone now that's downtown in Friday Harbour. More beauty and stones. How can you not love stones like that? And my wife. So this is our daughter Grace, and one of the first big stones that I scooped out that I found on the island. And I think it shows a lot about the relationship of the human body to big stones, and it starts to talk about us mortal humans in a relationship with Earth and much, much older elements that are millions of years old. And I feel like I'm hearing some of that theme come through in other people's art and seeing that. And I like how I can share this in stone, and we have some relationship in the stories we're telling. Our daughter Fiona, that's the same stone, just being roughed out. You can see a bit of the technique there where I was using a heavy saw to make big cuts and break chips out. This is bigger. This is about 14,000 pounds, and it's a client asked me to make one that two could sit inside, and now it sits on the edge of the, looking across the Salish Sea over towards the Olympic Mountains, so it's sort of a little nest to look out from across the water. This is the couch. I got really surprised by how much I like seeing people sit in these stones. It was very fulfilling, and I really love that it can be art, but it's also very accessible, and anyone can have a relationship with it. Where stones come from is important. I carry the history of the stone, what it went through, and where I found it into my work. And this is down on the Oregon coast. It's a secret beach, but it's kind of a dream beach that I may have seen in a dream before I found it. But it's all just these perfect rounded basalt cobbles. And they've become a source for pieces like this. I call this one Blue River. It's getting at the relationship between how humans make things in the earth, the relationship between earth structure and human structure. And this one sort of asks the question, which came first, or how do they work together? And it starts to tell a story. And I could tell you more, but I like leaving a prompt so that other people can start a story. And I've done a series of these. This is kind of one of the next ones. It's just, there's so many infinite variations, it's mind-boggling. Like this one that tilts upwards, vertical city. What's exciting is that now the light moves through it and opens up some other potentials. I think some of these suggest an orb floating in space, which either could be a sci-fi reference or it's our Earth, so we can look at it either way. Here's a detail. The glass, it's a lost wax casting process, so my original models to make the glass pieces are modeled in wax or clay, and then I do a sort of lost wax burnout technique to create a mold to pour glass into. It's pretty laborious and picky work, but I enjoy it. So going on with sort of Earth, human structure, fantasy, this is more of a architectural experimentation series, and I call it the Shelter series. My dad was an architect, and when I was a kid, I'd go into his office and he'd just have sketches, hand-drawn sketches all over the walls, and a lot of them were fantasies of things he wanted to make, but never quite got to make because he was busy being a professor or building useful houses. But the fantasy idea, I think, started going there. Another along that line. I took molds of deer bones that I found on Katy Mountain to create the bronzes, and then sort of reconfigured them as architecture. So I love how bones suggest architecture. It's sort of a way of also pointing at how we can keep looking back at nature and learning more and more. The stone on top it's also stone. It looks metallic, but it is a piece of columnar basalt. This is more of the Shelter series using bones. It's one of my favorite multimedia pieces that I have done so far, because in multimedia work, you have these different mediums, and you've got to learn each one really well and let each one do what it really wants to do and be, and then get them to speak to each other without conflicting. And I feel like I'm still just learning that, but I like this one comes together. I feel like it's kind of a three languages speaking together and being unified. This piece is called Cloud Writing. Here's the detail. Stones have been used so much for leaving messages, storytelling, in every culture. You know, we know Egypt and Great Britain, the large standing stones that leave messages. So I'm kind of going with that into a more abstract language and setting up a lot of subconscious patterns and opportunities for different kind of storytelling. I found that for a lot of people, these are like Rorschach prints. And the more time you spend with them, the more you go inside and find different things. This one is very shallow, but it's I'm making an attempt to use my cutting tools to look like I'm drawing and painting as well as doing relief carving. And I like that crossover, sort of like a charcoal drawing. Here's another one in that series of drawing and cutting into the rock, but now I'm cutting deeper. I really love this approach, and I've got some in my studio that some of you saw yesterday where I'm pushing more into different depths and combinations. And it's really entertaining. For me, I feel like I'm going into a rabbit hole as I make it and draw it, but also I can keep looking at it and finding these other relationships. Even though I've carved it, I still get surprised by it, and I like pieces that let you do that and keep on going and finding new things. This one's called The Secret Language of Trees, Stars, and Flowers. I did that a few years ago. And I like to lie on the ground and look through an old growth Douglas fir forest and see the branch patterns from the ground up. So they're making these, you know, infinite arcs and crisscrosses in the sky. And so this was kind of a stylized way of thinking about that, of looking into the sky. That's a simple piece, basalt. It's called Sun Worshipper. This is on the one corner of the island looking across at Victoria, so it's kind of across the Salish Sea, catches the morning light, and it's a good piece that transcends the ego of the artist or even the stone. It's more like it starts to become the nature. And I think that's one of the important goals of my work, is to move beyond that so the artist's ego starts to go away. I got one more image. That's it. And that's the same thing, just letting go, you know, taking in Mother Nature, putting it in the stone, and then putting it back. And I feel like this works really well. This is inner Salish Sea. Roche Harbour's up to the north a little bit. This is an inner bay. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
This is an overview of my work over many years. I started off doing quite naturalistic types of work. When I was a young guy, I did a lot of nature studies, analytical studies, just endeavoring to try to teach myself how to draw in a very traditional manner. And then transitioned into thinking about other types of things. So I did a lot of, started doing landscape painting. And these ones, something like that, is probably about 6 by 7 feet or something like that. And this is actually, this one on the screen right now is actually an imaginary scene. And then I moved from that into more abstracted landscapes, and we'll be working more with paint and qualities of paint and layering, and being more abstracted with how I was doing things. This is a piece that was installed in Vancouver and still there at the Bentel Center in Vancouver, in downtown Vancouver. And it's called Midnight Lanterns, and it was a commission piece for a building downtown. That's probably, I don't know, 12 by 12 feet, something like that. This is a shot of my studio space, and this is The piece in the middle there, at the center part, is probably about 8 or 9 years old, and it's called Sarah Palin Rides Again. And it was showed at the Chicago Art Fair and the Toronto Art Fair. And so I do a lot of theme-oriented pieces, and I tend to jump around all over the place. We do different things. This was the very first painting. I'm going all over the place here with the slides, but anyhow, this is the first painting that I showed in New York at the Forum Gallery. They picked me up to show my work from the Toronto Art Fair. And so these images, something like that, the figure in the middle, and these figures here are probably life-size. So I did that for a period of time. I got tired of landscape, started doing figurative work, and of course I do things for a period of time, and then I inevitably get a little bit tired of doing it. So I want to move it on to something else. When we moved to Salt Spring Island 20 years ago, I was obviously very captivated by our environment. So I then started painting a lot of figurative work, people in environments. Even at that time, I was adding on elements onto the sides of paintings. So a lot of these are one-off theme-oriented pieces. This piece here is probably, I don't know, 6 feet by 8 feet, something like that. And I remember building a huge crate for that, and it was so heavy I couldn't move it. So I ended up taking the piece out and rolling it up and sending it to the person who bought it down in Los Angeles. So again, a lot of these types of pieces here that were right in my immediate environment. My family was there. My daughter was playing at the beach. So that would be a life-size image. The paint's very thick, like a lot of the images in the museum. And a lot of pulling over of paint and a lot of layering up of things. And this is a piece that had to do with voyeurism. I've got a figure on a dock there with a camera in the foreground there. So I was trying to create a triangulation between the visual, the person looking at the image and the image itself. So again, it's interesting. A lot of times I start off quite representationally, and then slowly it moves or morphs into a more abstracted aspect. And I was using a lot of different materials to build something like that up, like cutting pieces of paper out, putting it on the canvas, pulling it over. This is another image in my studio. It has to do with viewing things. These figures are looking off into the distance, and of course I've got a ticker tape across there, so like denoting potentially a crime scene or something that's going on. So you don't know whether you're in the crime scene or you're looking out to the crime scene. This is actually a source image from a photograph of my daughter and a friend at a fair, so I did that. And again, the figures are quite a bit bigger, and again, going towards them being a little more abstracted, so they ended up having more of an abstracted kind of. I went on a hunting trip with my brother a number of years ago, even though I'm not a hunter myself, and took a lot of photographs of him in the environment doing things with his rifle, and did a series of pieces based on that. And this is an image of him at the front of the canoe, peering off into the fog. Again, I quite often use a lot of paint in my paintings. Earlier on, I was much more about illustrating things, but now I'm more about using the materials and layering things up. I was in Esquimalt for this image here, and I was trying to take photographs of warships, and I couldn't get any, and I had my camera, and I walked down, and there was this fellow, and he had his head in the fridge. So I took a photograph of that and then superimposed my daughter on top of it here. So I was trying to, again, create these different environments, and of course it evolved from the beach images into things that are more day-to-day experiences of people in very common environments. But I like the juxtaposition of like a girl at the beach here, or sitting on a blanket with an old beat-up car. This is a painting that's about 7 by 8 feet, and it's called Allegory of a Truth and a Lie. And this was probably one of the few staged images that I did It was taken around the swimming pool of our house. I hired a model, and my daughter just came out of the house. She was supposed to be in bed, but she came out, and we just kept taking photographs and turned it into a piece. This piece here, again, was part of the same photo shoot, and again, it's about 7 by 8 feet, and I had a couple of friends pose, and I was thinking about, I'm always thinking about all the different artists who've inspired me over the years, and so I have them kind of layered in there, the different references to different contemporary artists and also to historical people as well. Again, this one's probably about 7 by 8 feet, and I had a little bit of a dinosaur in there and iconography. This one here, we went to Paris, and I was in the Natural History Museum there, and I superimposed Charles Darwin's portrait in front there. I was just intrigued by the whole building. The artifacts bled into the building, and so it just so reminded me of Darwin somehow that I decided to have that in there. This is another large piece. This was in Harper's Magazine about 7 or 8 years ago. So it has its own little narrative going on. So I do a lot of sort of one-off pieces that have intersection into certain things that I'm interested in at any particular time. This is another image of the Natural History Museum in Paris. There I am, that's a few years ago. I did a show that involved a lot of Canadian painters, so I did a series with Tom Thompson and Emily Carr in it, and this is from a source image of Tom Thompson on a northern lake, a Lake of the Woods I think it was, and I took the photograph and I really broke it down and did layering onto it. This is a portrait of Emily Carr on horseback, and it doesn't look like Emily Carr. We had my mother-in-law living with me at the time, and strangely enough, it ended up looking like my mother-in-law. So I don't know, I couldn't make it look like Emily Carr.
It's always so inspiring to hear other artists talk about their work and just articulate their inspirations. I'm a glass artist, glass blower. Started blowing glass in high school over there, working with artist by the name of Lark Dalton and his wife Corey Height. They have olive glass on Lopez Island, and so I started in high school blowing glass. And so when I first started, just built a very rudimentary shop and started making kind of utilitarian pieces of glass like you see here, just very rooted in traditional Venetian technique, and a lot of what we learn in glass comes from Murano, the island off of Venice in Italy. And so you see a lot of stripes and swirls and a lot of glass work wherever you see glass. Most likely you'll see something like that. Then I ended up being invited up to Pilchuck Glass School in 2003 to work with a woman called Karen Willenbrink Johnson, and she's an amazing sculptor, and she worked on William Morris's team. I'm not sure if you know glass, then you probably have heard of William Morris and his work. And that was really my introduction into sculptural glass. So, and so when I learned about sculptural glass and was introduced to that approach, I really found that I was able to build a narrative with glass much more than making utilitarian glassware. So I draw my inspiration directly from my surroundings and from the Pacific Northwest, and then also just the natural world in general. So we live in such a beautiful area. It's something that that has endless inspiration that you can kind of dip into that well. So this is one of the first kind of sculptural pieces I tried. It's called Leftovers. I'm really interested in our relationship with our food sources and where we get our food and sustainability, and also just, the salmon is like the lifeblood of the people of the Pacific Northwest and all the coastal people up and down. So I have some Tlingit heritage, and And so the salmon is always something that really speaks to me in my artistic practice. And it's such like a subtle form that it's very difficult to do. So it's something you can always come back to and try again and again. And so going with the aquatic theme, and I feel like glass, when you work glass, it's a liquid. So when it gets above 900 degrees Fahrenheit, it becomes a liquid, and it flows like water. Gravity will stretch it or pull it, and when it's really hot, it'll drip. So I'm taking these forms and making these soft aquatic forms. I feel like the glass really lends itself to that ocean. And as a glass worker, I'm very much interested in process and technique. So I want to find how to make something realistic and believable. So I'm applying all the different techniques that I've learned over the past 25 years of working in glass and trying to make something read as if it were realistic. And not just realistic in its form and texture, but I also want it to have some sort of lifelike hint of life to it, because it is a static object. So the trick is to getting it to look like it's moving a little bit or has some sort of hint of life. Glass is so fascinating. I mean, I'm a glass nerd, but like the fact that it absorbs light, it emanates light, it reflects light, it bends light, is just something that is so fun to exploit and to play with the optical qualities of glass. So try to do that whenever I can. I'm looking at proportion, form, and just trying to nail those things. I think maybe you don't know what a walrus looks like, but you know what it doesn't look like. So if it's wrong, the human eye can pick that up really easily. So the placement of the flippers, the placement of the eyes, the proportion of the body and the form is super important. And again, just working on texture and surface treatment to give it that kind of rubbery feel of a marine mammal. A right whale. And yeah, glass is just so fluid in its way that it moves. So constantly trying to kind of work with that. Yeah, form study. This is a collaborative piece with my wife, Kelly Odell, and she makes a lot of like ammonite shell forms. So she made the shell of the nautilus, and then I made the tentacles and the eyes, and then we put them together. And working collaboratively is always super rewarding. It's something that like you can make something yourself, or you can make something with someone else. And as artists, I think probably many of you would agree that it's really hard to relinquish that artistic control. I am very like controlling and precise in my work, and I want to hold on to that. So letting go of that is difficult, but also very liberating. And the end product is something, you come out with something that is unlike anything you would ever make on your own, because it's two different sets of hands going into it and two different approaches. So it's always something that is super rewarding and super fascinating for me. And so in that vein, this is another collaborative piece I did with Preston Singletary, who's another Tlingit artist, and he does a lot of form line design work. So these are just a couple shots of us working at the Tacoma Glass Museum in Tacoma, Washington, putting together a collaborative shark piece. I don't know if you can't really see the form line design on there so well, but I'll make the body form. This is Preston sitting at the bench with a torch, and then he'll do sandblasting of the form line design, native style on there. So again, it's something that is totally different than something I would make, and it's different than something he would make. So it's really rewarding to work like that, and the end product is something that's completely unique. So that's been a really a great relationship, working with Preston and using that approach to make collaborative works together. This is a gray whale, similar to the piece I had up in Salt Spring, but with collaboration with Preston. And yeah, and so I was born on Lopez Island and grew up there, and then I moved to Stanwood to work at Pilchuck and lived on the mainland there in Stanwood, Washington, close by, but for 15 years. And then we bought a piece of property on Lopez, and we moved back there in 2018 and built a studio. So we have a beautiful studio over on Lopez Island where we can make our own work just next to our house, and it's such a joy to work in this space. And it was a huge project, but yeah, such a rewarding thing to do. So super fun. I couldn't be on the studio tour because of the geographic distance, but yeah, you guys are welcome to come visit anytime if you make it over to Lopez Island. And that's it. Thank you so much.
I'm one of the artists from Salt Spring Island, and I want to thank the people of San Juan Island and also our neighbors on Salt Spring for making this all possible. How did I get here? That's a question everybody wants to know. How did we get here? So I started off thinking about salmon and how this resource that really energized the whole coast is diminishing, and how we let that happen and what we can do to change it. In 2010, we had the largest run in over 100 years that went up the Adams River, and this is what it felt like. We had so much salmon. We ate salmon all the time, and that's what made me realize that this is what it used to be like, and that's why the First Nations culture on the coast was so vibrant, because the protein came. Runs like that happened 10 months of the year instead of once in over 100 years. These pieces, I decided to use historic images. I was working with beeswax on plaster, on board. The images were 150 years old from a book, and the rust is actually rust. At the same time, our friend Tom Reimken, who teaches at the University of Victoria, is a field biologist, and he started noticing that trees closer to streams are bigger than trees far away. And he asked the question, why is that? He took 1,400 core samples, and this is some of his raw data. And he followed a nitrogen isotope N15 and found that salmon contain 13 times the amount of nitrogen from the ocean in their bodies, and they are, along with eagles, bears, and wolves, they are a nitrogen delivery system for the entire coast up to the Rocky Mountains. That's why trees closer to streams are bigger. This eagle is a Muybridge eagle from 1840, I think. He kindly allowed me to use one of his essays, and he gave me some of his raw data, and so that is, I really wanted people to know about this. Everybody knows about it now, but at that time it wasn't so evident. From there, I started looking at the southern resident orcas, and they only eat salmon. So here is an orca swimming through a school of salmon. The orca image was from 1850. I worked on acrylic sheet. This is the last time I've used plastic. And so it's beeswax, graphite, and rust on both sides of the acrylic. So you could see inside and outside. Okay, so while I was doing this, I needed to make a maquette to place all of the panels. Like, how do I tell people where to hang it? And I needed a base. And so the base, I decided to use a piece of styrofoam, which I didn't have. I just had hunks of styrofoam. So I stuck them all together, and I had skewers to put in with the little miniatures, and they kept falling apart. So I thought, okay, I'll sew fabric around that just to hold it together so I can put the skewers in. So that's what got me sewing fabric around things. Really, that's how it happened. And I got intrigued on how to use form and fabric. And so I loved the way that the tightness of the fabric over parts of it. And then, this is what happened. I went to the thrift store and I got all of this junk, and I started really looking at those shapes and what to reveal and what to obscure. I have to say, women got it. You know, textiles, domestic objects. Most men didn't. And I wanted to make it accessible to all men, especially captains of industry. I wanted them to think about, what does it take to make these things? What do we have to destroy on the planet to make these objects as we take the resources, as we transport them, as we use them, as we power them, and then they just end up going to the landfill. So I decided I would try things that men use more of. Not a lot of men do ironing and cooking, although that's getting better, but they sure use a lot of remotes and leaf blowers. So this worked. I actually hit a sweet spot. So I have about 1,000 remotes now. I can do a wall 100 feet long, 10 feet high in this way, half a dozen leaf blowers, and they float through like spaceships, and stereo equipment with knobs in particular. Here I am trying to recreate the geology of a core from a volcano. In Vancouver, we have Siwash rock, and I wanted to honor the planet by recreating that with some of the resources that had been removed. And so this is the process. Remote controls, linen, old sheets, tablecloths, old curtains. I pin them in place, and then I sew them. And as I am sewing, they become tighter. I created a label for each one, and it will tell me what it is, where it came from, and when I enshrouded it. And then I've written it into my archival logbook. So if you give me a remote control, you can be part of the project. So what's the bigger picture? As I have been obscuring these objects, I think about the animals that have been affected by their habitat loss. So I wrote to Wildlife Rescue Services, and they kindly shared x-rays of animals that came to them, some of them rescued, some of them not. And then the other thing I think about is the value of artist residencies. I don't know if you have one here. We have one on Salt Spring. I go to them in different places, and they will energize, just like your art museum energizes the community, and artist residency energizes the people where it takes place, and it certainly energizes the artists. I was at a residency, and I was going to do discarded small appliances. Well, the town was so small, it didn't even have a thrift store. But where I was, there was a cupboard that was filled up every day with cardboard and single-use plastic containers. So I switched from small discarded small appliances to single-use plastic. And I was reading about the plastic in the ocean, and I had been given all the birch bark. And so I thought, I want to do something about the fisheries being diminished. And I remembered this painting by Winslow Homer and thought that the dory is the perfect symbol because that's what cod was fished from, sustaining millions of people over centuries is now gone. We're trying to hold on to our salmon, but this one is gone. While I was at that residency, I had the picture, and there was the cardboard, and there was the single-use plastic containers just magically appearing every day. So I would go and get the cardboard, and I made a facsimile of a dory out of cardboard. And people heard that I was doing that, and they started arriving with their plastic. Don't tell people that if you're going to enshroud plastic. You get overwhelmed. So I have this idea to take a gallery and make a net that goes from wall to wall and fill it with the single-use plastic. But I don't have that gallery, and I needed to learn how to knot the net. So I started making these ghost nets. And the nets are made out of cotton seine twine, which if it's lost in the ocean, it will rot. The plastic nets that are used now will never rot. So last year I was so fortunate to go to New York for three months, and while I was there, I did make a net for the ceiling of my studio. When I arrived, it was a sculpture painting studio. It was so dirty because it didn't matter, right? But for me it mattered because everything I do is white. So I ended up enshrouding the studio first. We put a painter's cloth down on the floor, and then I started enshrouding the shelves and the tables and the desks so that if I put things down, at the end, it would still be white instead of gray. I have been working, growing salt crystals on pre-plastic wiring, a facsimile of. And while I was in New York, I learned how to incorporate carbon into the salt crystals to make shades of gray and black. And this was my studio. There's the wire that I use for the words. There I'm growing the salt crystals. There's the carbon, and then this was a piece I did there. People thought that this was neon. And I had a neon piece. I've had a neon piece I've wanted to do forever, but it's so expensive and it's so fragile, it would have to be permanently installed above an old factory. And it would be a giant needle and thread sewing a patch in the sky, because we are being asked as individuals to do our part to deal with climate change. Do your part as an individual to deal with climate change, to deal with plastic in the oceans, to recycle, reuse, and all of those things. If we had used that method when we had the ozone layer problem, if we had said, okay, everybody climb up on a ladder and sew a patch in the ozone, that's crazy. So the whole world got together and made a decision to stop manufacturing those chemicals, and it worked. The ozone layer is being healed. We're not all dying of skin cancer at an alarming rate, enough of it. So we have to, I don't know how we demand that all the governments come together and deal with this global issue on a global level, instead of asking us to think that we have to do it individually, because we can't. We don't have enough time. And that's it.
Well, as Raven alluded to, and I know that you all feel this way too, which is why you're here, it's just fantastic to get a better understanding of why people create. It's inspiring to hear people's stories and their process. And so thank you all for sharing, those who are up here speaking. I want to acknowledge one thing real quick. Barbara Cox. This whole exchange was the brainchild of Barbara, but it took lots of people collaborating to make it work. So thank you, Barbara.